Professor Tony Venables to come up to the dais. We now are going to have our special lecture, and fortunately we have tried to, by cutting short on our lunch, we managed to catch up with the time. Need an introduction this morning.
Good afternoon. This is the first session after lunch. Mr. Tony Venables will be speaking on urbanization for development. UNDP report in 1990, the SDI report, it said that 50% of the developing world will be having around 50% urban areas by 2015. This was 23 years old report. Now we find that more or less, although the number is not matching up that much, but yes, urbanization is increasing. People are finding more job opportunities in urban areas because of the changing farm practices and non-farm practices. People who did not have good opportunity in rural areas, they are moving to urban areas. But the provisioning of public services in the urban area is not commensurate with the influx of masses from the rural areas. That gives us a challenge of poor water supply, poor sanitation, drainage and sewerage problems, housing for the poor people. You'll find that many slums are coming up in the urban areas. If you go by the experience of urban areas in Bihar, and the story is more or less same elsewhere in the country also, most of the urban areas are not having sufficient revenue resources to give all the services that is expected of them. The urban property taxes are not updated, holdings are not updated, the rates are not sufficient to meet its expenditure. The result is, most of the time, the state government has to give grant or subsidies to fund the activities of the urban local bodies. But in the same report, UNDP mentioned, rapid urbanization is neither a crisis nor a tragedy. It's a challenge for future. And that's very true. Even today, after 23 years, we find that situation is more or less the same. We are still grappling with some of the problems of urban areas. In a welfare state, you find that India has been giving emphasis on the reduction of income inequity in rural areas. Many welfare schemes are being run in the rural areas, whether it is in housing, job creation, employment, Manrega, Indra Awas Yojana, or connectivity of villages, Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, or provisioning of health services, access to better educational facilities. But the same emphasis is not given to urban areas. If you go by the enumeration of people living below poverty line, you will find that in rural areas, almost in the entire country, we have a very good data bank of all those who could potentially be a beneficiary of government scheme because they are living below poverty line. But if you go by the same standard or yardstick for urban areas, there are problems. Still, we have not been able to finalize the beneficiaries, the people living below poverty line who could be beneficiary of government welfare scheme in the urban areas. There are still problems. Similarly, for many government schemes, National Rural Health Mission or other missions, for urban areas the emphasis has not been, or the execution of the programs have not been as well, as good or as it was in the urban areas. So that brings us to the problem of urban areas. So today, Mr. Tony Venables, who is a professor of economics at the University of Oxford, he is a fellow of the British Academy and of Econometric Society. He has held former positions, including that of Chief Economist at the UK Department for International Development, Professor at the London School of Economics. He's been Research Manager of the Trade Research Group in the World Bank, and he's been also advisor to the UK Treasury. Mr. Mr. Tony Venables has published extensively in the areas of international trade and spatial economics, including work on trade and imperfect competition, economic integration, multinational firms, and economic geography. Today, he'll be speaking on urbanization for development. Mr. Tony Venables.
Good, thank you for that introduction, and obviously thanks to all the organisers and everyone who brought me here and that was here a moment ago. You know that. Yes, good, thank you. What I want to talk about today, what I'm going to do, it's not going to be a research paper. It's going to be very much a sort of overview. It's not going to be about India in particular. It's going to take a more of a world view, a historical view at some points, an Africa view at some points, but hopefully also material that will resonate, that will be relevant and of interest to this audience. But above all, I think it's going to take a long view motivated by the numbers that I've put here. As you see from the slide, something over 2.5 billion people will be joining urban populations over the next 30 or 40 years. Now, the world has just reached the 50% urbanized stage, but this is almost as much again. So basically, in the lifetime of most of the people in this room, we're going to have to double the urban capital stock of the world to accommodate these people. Put it differently, 1.5 million people a week joining cities. Looking backwards in India, it's been about 200,000 a week over the last decade, and I think is expected to continue at that sort of rate. So clearly there's an enormous challenge to get this right. These are long-lived structures. As I say, for the next 30 or 40 years, we're going to be doubling those structures, and then those structures will be around for a couple of 100 years. So it's incredibly important that, in addition to the management problems, seeing cities as a problem to be managed, we also take a sort of long view that cities really are where we're going to be working. Cities are productive places if they're designed and work properly, and where we're going to be living, and we want people to have a good quality of life. So it's that sort of long, bigger picture view that I want to think about, rather than particular problems to do with Bihar, Patna, or India. What I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the component parts that make a city, and then how they hang together into an overall urban form. So I'll sketch some of the main ideas from the literature in doing that. And then we'll have a sense of how cities might work, how they should work. And then I'll go back and think, well, okay, how do we get there? How do cities get built? And I'll actually spend a bit of time talking about how London got built, sort of 19th century experience, which sort of benchmarks, I think, some of the problems and some of the issues that we see today. And there's a little bit of India-relevant stuff that I've pasted in at the end, but I hope it'll work okay. So I guess when we think about cities, it's helpful to think of the three components. They're residential places. We better be building them to house the natural population growth and the immigrant flows that will be coming. They're commercial centres. Obviously, jobs will be increasingly in cities. So there are those two components, and then they better be linked together by infrastructure. So infrastructure, sometimes I call it the glue that holds things together, but it's probably better to call it the lubricant that enables the things to communicate with each other and the city to work. And obviously those components come together in sort of what gets referred to as urban form. So the shape of the city, you know, where stuff is, how people interact, what the transport systems look like. So think of those components coming together in urban form. Now I think the key to thinking about how to design, what we want cities to be like, is to recognize that cities are the outcome of a balance between an increasing returns force and a diminishing returns force. So the increasing returns is, you know, cities are productive. Big places where people are close together are highly productive. You know, cities are good things. They deliver that. That's the increasing returns element, but obviously the diminishing returns is, well, you know, crime, grime, congestion, commuting, all that stuff. So it's getting that balance right that is really at the heart of urban form. To think about that, yeah, land is the scarce factor. Yeah, we want people to be close for these productivity reasons, so we better be allocating land efficiently. And yeah, markets will do that. But also, this is a prime area where we really do need to be doing good public economics and good public policy in the large. Because obviously, as soon as we've got increasing returns, we know we're in a world of market failure of one sort or another. Yeah, infrastructure, again, will require public intervention. Congestion, market failures again. So we know that we want a market to get the micro-efficiency right, but it's a public policy issue par excellence. Okay, let me say a little bit about the three elements, then urban form, and then how do we get there, how do we build these things. Okay, the elements, so commercial, residential infrastructure, just very quick, just two minutes, fairly obvious stuff on each of those. As I've already started saying, on the business side, the commercial side, yeah, cities bring the benefits of proximity. They make people productive. Lots of literature, lots of different mechanisms through which that happens. I've listed some of them here. Yeah, economies of scale in the provision of some public services, utilities, these things. Yeah, people are close together, it's cheaper to deliver that stuff. Large markets, which allow economies of scale within firms, and then maybe between firms, clusters of various sorts to grow. Probably the most important mechanism is really getting labour markets to work. Thick labour markets where people have got specialised skills, they're matching effectively, the market's competitive, there's an incentive to get trained, all that stuff going on. And then knowledge spillovers, networks of one sort or another. They're the sort of theoretical mechanisms, but I think we know from a lot of empirical work on cities in the developed world that it works. The benchmark number is that every doubling of city size raises productivity by like 3 to 8%, which is huge. Because obviously if you think, if you go from a city of 500,000 to a city of 10 million, you've really doubled quite a lot of times in that process. So these productivity gains are massive. So that 3 to 8% is a range that comes out of a much-cited survey. There's a nice bit of written work using a completely different methodology by Steve Redding and people, where they actually look at Berlin, which was a city that was divided and then reunified. So that's two natural experiments that they can use to estimate these productivity effects. They actually get larger numbers, it's sort of around 10% productivity gain. The cities in the developing world, are they achieving these, do they have the urban form, are they achieving these productivity benefits? Well, the empirical literature is much, much less. There's obviously huge amount of heterogeneity within the developing world. But certainly concerns that lots of countries just are getting the downside, getting the diminishing returns, rather more than they're getting the increasing returns. I guess in India that sometimes shows up in this notion that Indian employment is suburbanizing rather than urbanizing. Yeah, it's spreading out around the edge of Delhi rather than in the center. So I'll return to those issues later on. So one component is commercial, other component residential. Yeah, a couple of pretty obvious remarks here, but I want to make them. Yeah, getting the residential side right is really important. Yeah, first and foremost for human well-being. Bringing up your family and decent accommodation and all that, fantastically important. But also for productivity. I mean, the residential stuff had better hang together with the commercial stuff so people could get to work. So the productivity stuff really matters. If we're going to get the rural-urban migration, if we're going to narrow those wage gaps, cities had better be offering a place for people to come to where they actually want to live. But there are also other aspects of sort of residential urban capital stock. Yeah, we think of development as being about accumulating capital, and yeah, maybe human capital is the most important. But if you actually look at where capital is in high-income countries, at least a third of it is residential property, right? So it's actually houses, which is where most people have most of their wealth. That's most of what, a very large part of what has been accumulated. So it's an enormously important national asset. It's part of that accumulation process. Also, of course, building it is a fantastic way of creating jobs. These are non-tradable structures that are often pretty unskilled labour intensive. So if you want to create jobs, the construction boom is a pretty good way to do it. If you read some of the economic history, particularly on the sort of Canadian, American, Australian, these sort of New World cities, the sort of boom cities that really grew in the late 19th century, you look at the investment figures, and about 2/3 of investment in the whole country was just in going into building cities. So what these countries were doing was just building the cities for the countries. Huge levels of activity going on. And then infrastructure. A couple of quick points I want to make, still rather by way of introduction. All sorts of infrastructure, evidently. Some of it publicly provided, some of it privately. An important distinction is between rather local infrastructure, your seats, the sort of street layout, local drainage, street lighting, that sort of stuff, and the citywide network. And we'll see that in different cities, in different periods of time, some of these have been provided privately, some publicly, and in some cases, not at all. They fall down the gap in the middle and the things just don't get provided. Okay? And obviously infrastructure has a decisive role in sort of shaping the whole city as it develops. And there's so much we don't know about it, about its effects ex post, or about how to evaluate it ex ante. If infrastructure really is shaping the whole city, then a standard cost-benefit analysis is just not going to get it right. You need to have the whole sort of city growth agglomeration stuff. So lots we don't know about infrastructure. Okay, those three components, how do they hang together? Well, a little bit of basic economic theory. So let me just run through the standard urban economics model of the 1960s, which is still rather useful. That model says, okay, the business activity is going to cluster because of all the proximity stuff I just talked about. So that's typically called the central business district. Now, in practice, of course, cities might be polycentric, not monocentric, and maybe it's the services that now cluster in the centre and manufacturing that goes to the edge. But I'll show you some pictures in a moment that suggest that monocentric clustering of employment is still something that really happens in major cities. The other bit, residential, spreads out around the business district or districts. And the theory way of thinking about that is that commuting costs increase with distance. People are indifferent about where they live, so close-in places, they bid up the land rents. So there's commuting cost gradient going up, a land rent gradient going down. But obviously, as land rents are high in the centre, so centres are dense, right? And this is what the market will produce, conditional upon there being infrastructure, and will be efficient, conditional upon there being infrastructure. So you've got the centre, the residential stuff. Infrastructure determining the city layout, as I've said. And one other result from the theory, of course, is that the total rents, the total development gain, if you like, the present value of the rents earned by the city are enough to pay for the optimal amount of infrastructure. Right? There are theorems about that under various assumptions. Okay, so infrastructure, enough infrastructure, the right amount of infrastructure can be financed if you can get those rents, those development gains. So that's an important thing that comes out. As I've already said, as we think this through, there are always going to be these combinations of things that the private sector will do, things that the public sector will do, and market failures throughout. Okay, let's, with that introduction, let's actually look at some cities. I hope these things are visible. This is some guy at the LSE I actually haven't met, whose name I forget. It says on the bottom, I think. Should acknowledge him. Duncan A. Smith in LSE cities has really done this very, very carefully for three major cities. London, New York, Hong Kong. So this is employment density. So that model of the CBD, the Central Business District, actually, yeah, it looks pretty good when you see those city employment levels. And fantastically dense. You know, London, 140,000 jobs per square kilometre. So the square mile, the traditional city of London, the financial district, employs something over 300,000 people. So fantastically concentrated. For those of you who know London, there's a little spike to the right, which is Canary Wharf. New York, even more spiked. So yeah, what I'm trying to do here is emphasize the importance of this sort of density stuff in employment. You look at successful cities and it's really, really happening big time. Huge numbers of people working per square kilometre. And then the other bit from the theory was the residential stuff, you know, spreading out around it. Yeah, that happens as well. It's of very different degrees depending on the history and the culture and of course the topography of the city. So Hong Kong is somewhat constrained by being islands surrounded by water. So really dense. So this is, as I said, this is residential rather than commercial. New York, yeah, very dense, 60,000 people, residents per square kilometre at the peak. London much less so, but still this density spreading out is a pretty good model. These are some summaries of the same thing. So I think the top row is some Asian cities, Jakarta, Shanghai, Bangkok, residential densities. So Shanghai, absolutely classic, but enormously dense centre. The middle are European cities, same pattern. Bit of a dip in the middle maybe, because that's where all the business, everything is occupied by the business stuff. And then this is the residential, okay? So you're getting that pattern. And the same pattern for North American cities at the bottom. But of course, all these things are on the same scale. So North American cities, very, very much less dense, with the exception of New York and one or two East Coast ones. So to be precise, they're Atlanta, Los Angeles, and New York on the right. These are all sort of market economy cities. Let's look at some similar pictures for rather different economies. This is Johannesburg, Pretoria, that area. Now this was a region which clearly did not develop with free market forces. Population was being assigned to areas. So badly violating the pattern that we saw in the sort of theoretical model that we saw earlier. These are the analogous slices sort of aggregated around the disk. So Johannesburg there at the bottom, right? Hopelessly inverted, right? The centre has little population. It's out in what were the old townships around the edge. Brasilia was obviously not shaped by market forces, so it's market economy, but building that city was not something that was done by market forces. And Moscow, evidently. So these are the donuts rather than the cones. They're completely inverted city structures. And I'll come back to the implications of that a bit later on. This is just a summary table of sort of average density in the city area. And these things are difficult to get hold of because what is the city area, the measurement units and things. But still, some information here I want you to see. The colour coding, I hope you can see it. Red is the US, so they're the low density cities. Brown is Africa, there are only 4 there. Yellow is Europe, so they're sort of middling density. Barcelona down at the bottom there. London sort of in the middle. London at, well, sort of 2/3 of the way up. And then Asian cities, fantastically dense down at the bottom. So why don't I just read out? So from the bottom up, I'm sorry this is too small to read. From the bottom up, let me give you a few. Mumbai, the densest. Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Seoul, Shanghai, Seoul, New Towns, Tianjin, Hyderabad, Bangalore. That sort of bottom tranche of blue ones. And then above, you're hitting Barcelona, Moscow. Okay, So what I want you to have in your head, these sort of different parts coming together in urban form. Urban form, you know, probably matters a lot. We've got this theoretical model of the cone and these other cases. Okay, how do you get there? Right? Let's go from looking at those sort of snapshot pictures and theory to thinking about a process of getting there. Now, I want to spend, hopefully not more than sort of 10 minutes or so, thinking about how London got built. This is partly in response to popular demand after I talked about this on an after-dinner speech occasion some time ago. So there are some sort of cartoons and things here, a little bit after-dinnerish, but if you'll bear with me, let me do it anyway. Okay, so 19th century London, right? Per capita income, call it sort of $500 per head, and it's just sort of calibrating things. Horrible life expectancy. Rural UK 48, London 36, some of the northern cities 27. Essentially cities were growing by in-migration rather than natural growth. People went to cities to die, basically. Well, that was a bit earlier where they were really bad. They'd improved a bit by the 1840s. London, Britain highly urbanized by European standards. And then the population went from 1 million to 6 million during the course of the century. So clearly, a slower rate than we're seeing in major cities nowadays. But not, they're sort of comparable. I mean, London managed to house an additional 5 million people. I mean, basically from sort of 1820 through to the end of the century, over a sort of 80-year period. The commercial centre was pretty well clustered, the river and the port and all that. But the point I want to think through, and the contrast I want to pick up later on, is that London, there were slums and things, obviously, but basically London successfully accommodated this increase in population of 5 million people. It did so to quite a large extent by private sector construction of mass housing. And if you think about it, many developing countries essentially don't have any urban private sector mass housing being constructed whatsoever. Slight exaggeration, perhaps, but certainly some that fit in that category. So that's the sort of line I want to draw out. How did London do that? Let me run through very quickly, I hope, a set of conditions that look like they're pretty much necessary for this to work, and that appear to hold in London more or less during that period. First, property rights obviously matter if you're going to get this residential. If the private, let me focus this a bit more. If the private sector is going to do this job of actually building decent houses for fairly low-paid workers to live in, right, then this will be the sort of list of conditions that seem to hold in London. So property rights matter. And in 19th century London, they were generally clear and enforceable. And the process of acquiring land and doing that residential spread, excuse me, was actually quite interesting. The land was originally held by typically quite large landowners, farmers or even the very big sort of ducal estates. They leased it. They didn't sell it. They typically leased it on quite well, until 99-year leases, not that long, to developers. And the developers were sometimes builders themselves, or more often sublet it again to builders. The developers, it was an amazingly speculative business. Fortunes were made and fortunes were lost by these land developers, acquiring areas in London, putting up housing, and succeeding or failing to sell it on at a profit. But an important point, the parcels of land, these were large farmers and ducal estates that were leasing on to large developers. So the parcels of land were actually large enough such that when they were developed, the developers put in the road network, the sewerage, the basic sanitation, the water. That was all, those public goods, that infrastructure was internalized by the private sector doing this. Now clearly that happened in some middle class, Gorgon, whatever, but it was happening for the sort of mass urbanization. And I should also say, we should still be talking about property rights. Tenancy markets functioned as well as owner occupation. So these houses that were built went into both sorts of occupation. Second ingredient, infrastructure. Well, I just ran ahead of myself. There were these quite large developers doing a lot of this. So they were internalizing the layout of roads. Maybe they'd get a couple of hectares, put in the road plan, mark out where the houses were, and then sublease again to builders who build the things. But the point is that local infrastructure was being internalised. At the same time, the bigger infrastructure was being provided by private sector activity. So horse-drawn omnibuses in the first instance, but then, well, this year is the 150th anniversary of the London Underground. So from the 1860s on, the Underground, 1840s on, overground railways. And these were all run by private companies. So the private sector was putting in that infrastructure. So property rights, infrastructure, to which I'll come back. Rigorous laid out systematic building code from 1774 on. But that was just setting minimum quality and safety standards, right? It wasn't really imposing floor area ratios or enormously high building standards. It was just setting minimum levels that seemed to work. So when it came to constructing, yeah, people had to meet these building standards, but they weren't that rigorous. And the construction sector itself was enormously sort of vibrant and successful. Very strange. You had quite big firms, and then a range of firms down to a lot of small firms just building 1 or 2 houses a year. And if you look at the literature of that period, there are all these companies producing pamphlets of how to build a house. They would give you exact instructions of what to do and where to buy the stuff and how much it would cost. And so you could set up as a building company. It was free entry to that market. Fourth ingredient, to get this mass owner occupation, financial innovation, really important. As usual, the commercial banks were pretty much totally useless. So the developers were typically getting funds from insurance companies. It was a low or zero inflation age, so nominal interest rates were low. As I said earlier, there were leases, not sale. That diminished those capital requirements for the developers. And then a whole other institution developed, the building societies, that took on the role of taking savings from small depositors, then lending for house purchase. So low-income people could afford to buy houses through this device of the building societies. And originally the building societies were societies of builders pooling credit. But anyway, that's historical detail. Okay, but the upshot is those conditions were met. So this private mass housing was actually affordable. There's an example here, and they were marvelously forthright the way they talked about things. A fourth-rate house, right? That is 4 fourth-rate houses. So if you just look at the sort of 2 bits at the end, it's a 2 up, 2 down, 2 downstairs rooms, 2 upstairs rooms. But the basic arithmetic on that, if you were a skilled craftsman, you could buy one of those houses for sort of twice your average wage. If you're an unskilled labourer, 4 times your wage. Mortgages, maybe £7 a year if you had some capital, on a wage of £100, £50, whatever. So the system was delivering affordable housing. The private sector, rather, was delivering affordable housing for the masses. That's the point I want to make over. Obviously, in London now, professors of economics can't afford a house that big, but that's another story. Matrush will probably confirm that. Okay, that's part of the story. I said there were some cartoons. This is a rather sort of ghoulish one from about the 1840s, I guess. The local public goods were being supplied, were being done by the private sector. But of course, infrastructure is more than that. You need to join up, have the city-wide stuff. Okay? So the River Thames became a total sewer. So it was only reactively in response to crisis with a lag that the city-wide infrastructure got put in place. And a couple of things sparked it off. In the 1840s, people realized what caused cholera, realized you had to do something about water supply, getting that right. And then in, whatever it was, 1858, there was the Great Stink. It was a particularly hot summer. The Thames really did turn into a sewer. Parliament had to move. But then this fantastic bit of public building, where over the space of 3 years, 450 miles of sewers were built, 200,000 cesspits were linked up into a sewerage system. But the public authority, it came in with a lag, but the public sector had to provide the full city network. The local developers had done the local sanitation and the cesspits, but joining up was a citywide activity. And then that's obviously spread, originally sort of public health concerns, but then transport. The underground was private companies, but they got consolidated, regulated, eventually nationalized. Zoning came in, and of course nowadays many people would say zoning is much too strict, but anyway, that's not part of the story. What I want you to take from London is, well, it's this balance between sort of private, public sector. The private sector did actually deliver, as I keep saying, this sort of mass worker housing, which is rather important. It internalized some of the public goods. It set up a transport system that wasn't great, but it was good enough. But then it took, with a lag, rather too late, the public sector to do the citywide stuff. And of course, it's left while this had its strong points, it's left a legacy of some inefficiencies. Anyone who knows the layout of the London main railway stations, they're completely mad. It's just they were all done by separate private companies and have never been changed. Okay, so we've got the basic structure we want to think about. We've got one historical example on some of the things that might get you there. Let me now make some remarks about developing economies. Now, this is not going to be remotely comprehensive, but I just want to raise a few points and point in a couple of directions. I want to focus on two features. One is the residential side, and as I said earlier, the fact that many developing country cities, I mean, it's quite astonishing when you think about it for a moment. The private sector simply does not provide mass housing. So that missing. So I want to think about that a little bit. And then I want to think about the urban form question. Are you going to be a cone or a donut? And being a donut probably leaves you pretty inefficient and hopeless. So I want to think about some of the issues there. Obviously, even just doing those two issues, they each deserve a really careful, systematic analysis. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to use London as a sort of benchmark and run through the sort of checklist of what seemed to work for London and might be absent in modern developing country cities. Okay, property rights. That was the first thing that sort of did appear to work in 19th century London. What do we know? Now, as I go through this list, it's actually going to have more base in Africa than in India, I suspect. But I'd be interested to hear feedback as to how appropriate it is. Property rights, often privatized. Traditional land tenure systems replaced and privatized, but really not clarified. So, plots of land subject to multiple claims, things that drag on in the courts for years and years. Difficult to consolidate, which I believe is an Indian issue at the moment. Difficult for the state or other large developers to actually acquire blocks of land to do consolidation. Remember that in principle, the development gains are sufficient to finance all the infrastructure you need. But to do that, you have to have a property tax or something, and to have a property tax, you have to have a land rate and all that, okay? So absence of clear property rights, fighting on that. And also, of course, if you're going a private route on building houses, then people will presumably be taking mortgages, so they'll need collateral. So that's only going to work if there are clear and enforceable, legally enforceable ownership rights on what it is they've just bought, right? You're going to get collateral on a house if the legal system is clear enough to prop that up. So lots of developing countries, property rights is not, condition one, not working. And similarly on the tenancy side, lack of clarity or excessive regulation perhaps, killing the tenancy market as well. Infrastructure, very briefly. Local infrastructure, go on, I guess, does it publicly, privately. Other places do it publicly. Lots of places it simply doesn't get done, right? The informal settlements, the road network just isn't laid out, and it's enormously expensive and difficult to retrofit afterwards. You do want these things to be laid out in advance. Citywide infrastructure, well, masses of detail here we could talk about, but general points: lagging, not leading. Bad delivery, although construction companies getting better, as we heard this morning, and again, failing to capture the development gain through property tax or whatever to finance the stuff. Financial innovation, is that condition being met? Well, again, lots of developing countries, I think, commercial banks just failing to play the financial intermediation role for that market, just not there. Obviously, more difficult to do in inflationary environments. You need innovation in terms of indexing mortgages, which some countries have done, others haven't. But if you're paying 25% nominal, then even if it's only 5% real, a mortgage market is not going to work. And often in lots of countries, policy undermining a market when it does get going. So financial innovation needed, happening in some places, don't know about India, but lots of places, that market just dead. And then building standards and costs, which I do want to say a little bit about. And again, this is a bit Africa-centric, but maybe relevant. A lot of British colonies, in 1947, I don't know which side India was on this, Britain introduced a Town and Country Planning Act that set very high building standards, arguably too high for Britain at the time. And of course, a lot of the colonies just inherited them. And then after independence, they couldn't reduce them. You couldn't reduce standards, right? They had ridiculously strict building standards, a lot of building codes, a lot of African countries, which of course means that they're basically ignored. So you get a sort of bifurcated supply where a few properties meet them, most totally ignore them. But totally ignoring them is really serious. It's not just the immediate effects, but if you want a second-hand market in houses, people had better have some confidence about the depth of the foundations. If they haven't got that, you haven't got a second-hand market, right? So it's really, not people completely ignored. If the building codes are so far out of line that they're ignored, you're killing a market again, right? Building standards, other bits of the construction stuff. Well, let me just say, the richest man in Africa is Mr. Dangote, who made his, I think it's $10 billion by a cement monopoly, basically in Nigeria. So construction costs quite high in some countries. And we heard this morning, again, a bit about inefficiencies and cartels in the construction industry in India, lack of entry in some places. So what I want to suggest is, there are a set of conditions here that if cities are going to deliver the residential capital stock that we want, there are a set of conditions that need to be thought about, and pretty much all of them are missing in many countries and many cities. And perhaps if one of them's missing, that's bad enough to screw things up, but many places, all of them are missing. 5 minutes, okay? Nearly there. So I said I'd say a little bit about sort of urban, private sector, mass housing, the residential side and the conditions for it, whether you're likely to get it or not. Let me say a little bit about the sort of bigger urban form question. So, we think, as I was saying earlier, that the cones are efficient, the donuts are inefficient and storing up problems. Now, on the basis of nothing more than casual observation, I've put Delhi together with Dar es Salaam and certainly many other African cities in the donut category. You saw it for Johannesburg and Brasilia and Moscow earlier, whereas Shanghai was clearly the cone, right? Stuff in the center and steep gradients. I think this matters, this urban form, what shape you come out with. I'll give a little bit of sort of evidence on that in a moment. But again, let's just think, well, if you're trying to evolve it, if you're trying to get there, what are the obstacles? What's going to help you get there in your environment, and what's going to block it? Well, the obstacles, a lot of the points I just made, the property rights, finance, all that stuff surely apply. But let me amplify a little bit on the regulation side, because I think this, from the little that I've read, I think this is a rather topical issue in India. So this business of floor space index regulation, or exactly the same concept with a different name, floor area ratios. So these are the ratios set in the regulations for the amount of floor space that a building can have as a ratio of the land area that it occupies. So obviously, 1-to-1 is a single story covering everything, or a 2-story building covering half, and so on, right? So cities set these things, they have often set them differently in quite small areas. But let me just give you some numbers. Now, this is from a recent 2013 World Bank report on urbanization in India. So this is just lifted from that. So these are the floor space indices for central business districts of various cities. Sao Paulo's odd, and forget that. Mumbai is right at the top of the list there, which suggests that Mumbai should have low density and very few high-rises. So people can explain this to me afterwards, because clearly neither of those things are true. But in regulation, I'll show you the Mumbai map in a moment. But then these other Indian cities, Chennai, Delhi, so coming in with these floor area ratios of, 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 3. European averages, for the centre, 1.5, 1.8. And then, of course, New York, 1 to 15, Singapore, 1 to 25. So if you're down at 1 to 2, as compared to somewhere on 1 to 25, that's a big difference, right? So the suggestion on this map also that these regulations in India are killing the sort of urban form that you probably want to evolve. This is 2004, I think, Alain Berthaud, so you can tell me this is all wrong. But if you can see the numbers, these are the floor area ratios. So the red area, they're actually getting up to 4, I think, but then down below unity in some of the brighter green areas on this map of Delhi. So strict regulation, apparently, killing the cone, or not, in Mumbai. Is it costly? Well, there's a study which is quite old now and rather simple, but quite a nice little study, quite carefully calibrated on Bangalore by Alain Berthaud and Bruckner. Trying to just take that very standard little urban model I gave you half an hour ago and calibrate that to Bangalore data and make a guess as to the cost of these things. So the sort of green, no, which is which? Yeah, the orange line is the actual, as calibrated, floor space index for Bangalore, okay? The green line is the legislated one, and it's wobbling a bit because they did actually calibrate quite carefully on the available land and things, so it's sort of wobbling around a bit. So you see citizens of Bangalore are amazingly law-abiding, apparently. They're all under the legislated FSI until the point at which the blue line, which is just taking the Bangalore population and simulating what it would look like in an efficient spatial organization, right? The blue line is what it sort of should look like, and then you compare that with the legislated and the actual. So a little sort of calibration exercise of a very simple model, but then obviously backing out some numbers. So they claim that the restrictions bind over about a quarter of the city, so that's the bit to the left where the green is forced, where the orange is forced on top of the green. The restrictions are binding over that area on the disk. If they hadn't been there, the city would have occupied 10% less land. Okay, so that immediate release of or less occupation of agricultural land. It would have saved several percent of household income on commuting costs if it was more of a cone rather than being forced into that shape. But what they don't do in the simple little exercise is really the next step, which in my view they should have done, which is to say, let's take those productivity numbers seriously. If we do think that density generates productivity, and there's lots and lots and lots of econometrics on that, then let's also work out the productivity implications of having, Bangalore being a bit sort of suburbanized with, offices and IT companies around the edge rather than concentrated in the center. So the bottom point there, it would have been nice if they'd tried to put a number on the productivity loss due to the agglomeration benefit foregone by forcing a wrong urban form on the city. Okay, that's an attempt to give you a sort of bigger picture stuff. So I haven't talked about service delivery in Patna or these sort of more pressing urban questions at all. But I think it is really important, as I said at the beginning, that we do take a long view on this. We are investing, the next 30 years are crucial in building the the capital stock that will, where people will work and live. Half humanity will work and live for the rest of time. So it's really quite important to think about getting it right. So a couple of concluding comments. Yeah, obviously there's a research agenda here, a great one. There are rather few cities for which those sort of density maps that I gave you are available. But really getting the satellite data, linking it with the GIS reference household surveys, the city transport maps, even the sort of mobile phone usage and things, really building up a picture of where stuff is happening and what is going on and what the interactions are in depth in a wider, bigger number of cities is important, and hopefully a project that's going to get going soon. Understanding the impact. I mean, I can talk about land tenure, building regulations, infrastructure. Let's do some experiments or look at some natural experiments. Let's actually get some data on that. Building infrastructure. What do we know about the effects of a road, really, on how it relocates things, changes occupancy, changes economic activity? A huge amount of work needs to be done. And it's difficult because the location of the road is endogenous, but there's work that needs to be done. There's policy work on the design of urban public finance, housing finance, all that stuff. I've said nothing about the evolution of slums, informal settlements, which obviously that's really important as well. And then the whole political economy, running the city, but also the relationships of the city up to the central government. We know in China there are powerful incentives that deliver different results. So all that stuff, really important research agenda. The policy agenda corresponds to some extent, but the point I want to make here is we've got these multiple components, residential, commercial, infrastructure. They need to hang together. So there are multiple components, and each of them depends on multiple things, right? As we saw thinking about that housing stuff, lots of conditions have to be met. So you do need joined up policy. It needs to be policy that's the housing department and the finance ministry and the mayor and the central government and some lawyers, right? It does, some lawyers, the legal system. It does need to be seriously joined up policy, which suggests that it really has to come from the Prime Minister's office, basically, to make this happen. Okay, let me stop there. Thanks. Sorry, I've gone on.
My name is Prabhat. I am from Columbia University. Here, you talked about building safety standards and the codes. There is one parallel issue which was not discussed today, is about green building codes, and where the people who are buying the apartments, they are going to get paid off in next 20-25 years in terms of energy efficiency or comfort. But constructors who are selling those apartments as core and shell, they don't see incentives to put that in prices. I mean, because of the prevailing prices in the market. How can that be solved? I mean, of course, there is one way to, in the same way for the safety standards, or there can be some other ways to solve that problem. Thank you.
Yeah, so my question is, if there is economic activity, the institutions presumably have an endogenous relationship and react to that. The question is, what conditions lead to the institutions not efficiently reacting to that? And can you think of this in the Latin American context, where in the 70s a lot of money was borrowed, and there was apparently a lot of move towards an urbanization which didn't leave returns?
So two very urgent questions that arise in India and other developing countries, and I wonder what London's experience was in this respect. One is the extent of powers and responsibilities of local governments vis-a-vis the national government or the state government. The problem, I mean, the perception is that insufficient devolution to local bodies is a seriously constraining factor. And the other is what about squatters in all the shanty towns?
Johan Surupalainen, Columbia University. So I found the London example quite interesting because what seems to have happened there is that the private sector provides the local public goods and then the public sector provides the city-wide public goods. But how would that work today when many of these cities are developing without the local public goods? Is it possible for the public sector to provide both, or is it necessary that you first have the local public goods? Because if it is, then the lag until we actually get the city-wide public good could be really long.
there any more questions? Okay.
Yeah, let me try and answer some of these, starting with the last. Yeah, I think the point I wanted to highlight there is that there is this sort of margin between what can conceivably be financed by a large developer, obviously depending on how large the large is, right, and what really has to be done by the city. Yeah, so London, historically, I mean, clearly not now, the private sector was doing the local stuff. Clearly, it's not going to happen in sort of inner city areas in developing countries. It might be happening in Gurgaon and these areas where I think it is happening, but we don't expect it to happen. Yeah, so what often happens, the public sector should be doing it, clearly, but what often happens is it just falls between the two cases, right? So it simply doesn't get done. So really all I wanted to do was have you thinking about the different types of public goods and then who provides them, and it could be one, could be the other, depending on the historical accident of the size in which those sort of land blocks were parcelled out, amongst other things. But then the risk that it doesn't get done at all just falls in between. Yeah, Dilip's questions. What about squatters? Yeah, talking about sort of formal private sector mass housing. I have once or twice been accused of being anti-squatter, which is not the case in the slightest. The point is, it's just in building a city, you do want that market to be there, to be providing the formal sector stuff. The management, I mean, I'm going to throw this back as a research question, but studying the evolution of informal settlements and the evolution of people through informal settlements seems to be absolutely fascinating and something that I think is almost surely under-researched, and that I would love to know much more about. I mean, clearly, we don't believe in bulldozing informal settlements anymore. If they're there, they're there, and they evolve sometimes rather successfully, getting upgraded. But that joint process of the transition of the physical stock and the transition of people, perhaps through over several generations, through that, should be on the research agenda list. You asked about local governments. Yeah, so, yeah, well, it'd be interesting. I had really no idea about the Indian experience here. I mean, the African experience is so often that they have little power and they're really not joined up anyway. I mean, Dar es Salaam is basically 4 separate cities with 4 separate administrations. So any notion of citywide stuff is just completely hopeless. China at the other extreme, we've obviously got the central government just setting very high-powered incentives for mayors to act in a fairly high-handed way in securing the growth of the city. But if people know about the Indian, as I'm sure you do, I'd be interested to hear. The second question, I'm not sure I fully understood. So institutions endogenous to urbanisation, yes. So what was the question? Yes, they are.
So my question was, why don't you have institutions that respond? I mean, if there is private economic activity building up, do we need, I mean, so your lecture, do we need an exogenous intervention, or would these institutions evolve slowly on their own in terms of building regulation?
You mean governmental institutions?
Yes,
or
government, yes, government.
Well, then, yeah, I mean, yeah, the institutions change because, well, for a lot of reasons, but it's partly because people around this table, the economists, identify problems and say, yeah, we need design and change and make the institutions function better or change. So yeah, institutions do evolve, but it's not a sort of black box evolution. It's one that's steered by discussions of this type, I think.
Is that an answer to your question? Oh, you don't just sit back and wait for the institution to evolve in sort of Darwinian time, do we? Yeah. The first question was on energy efficiency. I think I got it, although I didn't actually catch the sort of green word at the beginning. Yeah, cities are green first, as a matter of fact, as you look, compare, within a country, rural versus city dwellers, for obvious reasons of economizing on transport costs and things. So cities are green. Cities vary hugely in the extent to which they're green. You saw those density maps for, Shanghai as against American cities, so the transport implications are evident, and that's obviously another argument in favor of density in cities. I think your question was, how do you get the capital expenditure on making property green if it's going to be rented out? Yeah. Well, the perfect market and the far-sighted, builder should be able to see those benefits. In practice, I guess what we're certainly seeing is, a lot of subsidy on the one hand and building regulations on the other to impose the green standards. So certainly in Europe, it's both. Mainly regulation. And again, you get into the sort of danger of regulatory standards can be set too high and they're just avoided. But basic building regulations on energy things are important and are happening, possibly in India, I don't know, certainly in Europe.
Yes, one more question. I guess, the one thing we didn't talk about, which is the 800-pound gorilla in the room about urban policy in India is political corruption, which often is, the amount of discretion there, it's kind of one of the last sources of rents, in terms of discretion. So the broader question I had for you was less about corruption in India, but when we think about how Tammany Hall politics became, in some sense, the politics of public good provision. What do we know about the history of the inflection point? Because in many ways, the ultimate public goods are sanitation and urban clean water. What do we know about the historical forces that changed politics from being about patronage and jobs to being about the provision of public goods in a way that allowed the political pressures to be put aside? Because this is probably the most important historical transition that somehow took place even in the US. And is there a parallel in the UK? I don't know the political history in the UK to know if there was something like a Tammany Hall machine at any point. And so what do we know about that transition? And are there any things that can be done to accelerate that transition?
Yeah, okay, well that's a small question that applies at all levels of government and across everything. Yeah, I don't think London ever had that sort of really corrupt phase that the Tammany Hall, the American cities had. It's an ingredient clearly is well-defined property rights on which transparent tax systems can be based. Now, did American cities have that? I have no idea. I guess London did from really quite early on. So you had that sort of tax base was fairly transparent. And then the second thought, and these are just sort of random thoughts rather than a coherent answer. The second thought is historical antecedents on this. So if you go back to London in the Middle Ages, it's fascinating. About 2/3 in the central areas of London, about 2/3 of male citizens were involved in some sort of public function. Constables, dog wardens, whatever. And astonishing. Not all the time, but during their lifetime, would be involved in that public function. So an evolution out of that, I guess, made a difference. I don't know. I mean, it's clearly a huge, wider question.
Any more questions? Thank you, Tony. If I can add to that green building question, basically it is within the realm of a regulatory function of the state. If the policy prescription is such that you incentivize the formation of green infrastructure, then it will be such. So the policy has to have all those inbuilt components, technologies, concepts which are current. Green building was not so much in vogue 20, 30 years back. Today it is. And many of the town planning acts of the states, you will find that these ideas are incorporated. Say, for example, just when Tony was saying that even though Mumbai has a FSI or FAR of 1.33, at times you find that the area has FSI of 2 or 3. So they are tradable developmental rights. You incentivize, say that, okay, if you meet my conditions, say for example, I want to have for economically weaker section some extra construction. So I'll say, okay, you go up to 20 story. In case you give me this square meter for economically weaker section, I'll give you 0.75 extra FSI. So these are, depending on the need and the context of the city or the state, these items will have to be inbuilt into the policy prescription which you have. In case, we all know that in most of the cities, since urban, as he said rightly, the urban local bodies, they do not have sufficient resources to fund their own activities. Although, one of the good things that he said, that there are theorems to prove and there is evidence that any city has that potential rent, if it is realized fully, then it can fund its own institutional and other service and infrastructure requirements. So that is there. But as of now, that full realization of its rent is not there. So the question is, there are market imperfections. There are government inefficiencies also. So today, the challenge for the state, for Bihar as well as for the state, is to formulate such policies which encourage such tradable rights, such green energy efficient concepts, redefining the property rights very clearly. Other than policy formulation, the question of enforcement is also very relevant. Because if we have very clear property rights, it has to be enforced. Now during the enforcement time, you will find that the revenue records are not so efficiently tabulated. You do not have clear-cut revenue data where you can have a dispute resolution mechanism. So then the question of implementation also comes into picture. So 2 or 3 things will have to be tackled simultaneously. One is have a clear-cut policy, and many things need not be reinvented again. You know the best practices of so many other cities. In your own context, you can incorporate it, customize it, and you can have your own policy. Second part of implementation of those policies, enforcement of the law, that is something which is lacking, at least in the Bihar context. You will find that many of the cities, you have high-rise buildings, FSIs are not maintained, you do not have strict enforcement, you do not have penal provisions. And in fact, if you go by some of the examples of the last few years, in many cities you will find that in many places, many accidents have taken place because the enforcement was bought. It was not that rules were not there. Rules were there, provisions were there. It could not be enforced. So that is a separate issue which needs to be tackled. But then, yes, urban properties, revenue reforms, urban ceilings, urban land reforms, these all need to be taken in one go. Because if you do not define your property rights clearly, there will be a problem. This will have implications on many other things. When you consider city as a growth engine of economy for manufacturing industry, you will find that one of the first things which an investment proposal would envisage is clear-cut property rights. So when you go through the World Bank's doing business in India report, you will find that this is something where the country is still lacking. We do not have high rating on this count. And that is why it becomes a deterrent for many of the potential investors also. Same thing applies for private investment in building in the city also. If you have clear-cut rules, clear-cut implementation strategy of the state, a very cautious and aware local self-government, there you will find that some semblance of normalcy is there. If the local self-government, the mayor and the body, local self-government body, they are very active, they are seeing the implementation of the act and the rules, then it is much better. But in case that is lacking, then you find that many haphazard growth, no planning, and then accidents also do occur. So that is there. Thank you, Tony. Today in this session, he has been able to give us example of London. Going by the history and the tradition, we can learn something for the future of our own cities also. That is some signature buildings only, but when he talks about this, this includes private investment as well as public investment. Private investment forms most of the construction activities in the city. So government investment, more or less, you'll find there you don't have many problems. Problems are when you have, because more than 95% of the growth of the city would be via private investment. So that is something where these things become relevant. Thank you, all of you. Thank you for such a nice session. Thank you.